Hey everybody, welcome back. Miss Calabrese here. So in this video, we're going to be introducing you guys to the urinary system. All right, so your urinary system, one of the reasons that we kind of study this one towards the end of A&P II is because this system really brings a lot of the other systems together. And so we have to kind of recall a lot of the things that we've learned over the past several weeks in order for this to make sense. All right, so the jobs of the urinary system, main jobs here are regulating blood volume, blood pressure, pH, and also electrolyte concentration, so the concentration of all these different ions in your blood. Urinary system is also important for excreting wastes, but retaining glucose. And it also has some endocrine function as it releases hormones like renin and erythropoietin. All right, so where do we find the kidneys? So they're these literally kidney bean shaped organs that are found behind the peritoneum. So these guys aren't within your peritoneal cavity. They're what we refer to as being retroperitoneal, meaning that they are behind the peritoneum. They're wrapped in this capsule of adipose tissue. For protection mostly, because if you think about the positioning of your kidneys, they're not super well protected by your ribs in the posterior. They're not super well protected by the iliac crest. So there's this they're open for damage, which is why they're wrapped in this extra capsule of fat for protection. All right, so your kidneys, which sit in this retroperitoneal space, are bean shaped, and kind of the medial indentation on this bean is called the hilum. So the hilum is going to be where the major vessels enter and exit the kidney, and also where the ureters exit the kidney. So the ureters are the tubes that are going to collect urine that's been produced in the kidney and carry it to the bladder. All right, so if we kind of zoom in on one of those kidneys and take a section of it, we can see that the kidney is kind of divided into two different regions: an outer cortex, which is this sort of more lighter colored tissue around the outside, and then an inner medulla. And the inner medulla is kind of composed of these different almost triangle-shaped structures called pyramids. All right, so cortex is on the outside, medulla is on the inside. Most of the filtration that the kidney does, so filtering the blood, is happening in the cortex. The medulla is mostly there for collecting the urine that's been created from the filtrate that came from the blood. Okay, so looking again at that renal medulla, we can see that the medulla is sort of divided into these triangle shapes, which are called renal pyramids, and then in between the pyramids are columns. So renal columns separated by renal pyramids, and then another renal column and another renal pyramid. So this is kind of how these the inside of each kidney is going to be arranged. Now, each one of these pyramids kind of comes to a peak in an area called the renal papilla. So the papilla is basically this kind of cone-shaped structure near the tip of each renal pyramid. And that's where we're going to start collecting urine that's been created from that renal pyramid. Um, those renal papillas are going to coalesce with other renal papillas and form what are known as calyces. So calyx is the singular form of that word, and calyx is just essentially a funnel. So we have what are referred to as minor calyces, these smaller ones. Those small minor calyces then sort of merge together into a few larger calyces. So those are the major calyces. And those two or three major calyces that you have in each kidney all sort of merge to form the renal pelvis, right? So the renal pelvis is kind of this area here that's sort of where all of these different calyces are dumping the urine together, right? And then that renal pelvis will funnel all that urine out through the ureter. All right, so here's a cadaver kidney, so you can see a kind of a different view of what some of those structures look like. So we can see the outer cortex of the kidney. Outside the cortex, the kidney is wrapped in a capsule. On the inside, we can see parts of the medulla here. Some of it's been removed so that we can see better these major and minor calyces. But you can kind of see how each renal pyramid comes to a point at the renal papilla, how those papilla merge together to form the minor calyces merge together to form major calyces, and major calyces dump their contents into the renal pelvis, which then becomes the ureter. So as the ureters leave the kidneys themselves, they're going to extend all the way down to your bladder, and they enter into the base of the bladder. So here we're looking, we can see the ureters up here. We can see the bladder that's sitting right underneath the peritoneum. So this is also not inside the peritoneum, but sitting right underneath the peritoneal cavity. So those ureters come in and enter the bladder from the bottom. So there are actually three holes in the bladder, two holes for the ureters where the ureters enter, and then one hole where the urethra exits. Right, so urine enters the bladder through the ureters, through these ureteral openings, and exits the bladder through the urethra, through the internal urethral orifice. All right, so the bladder itself can hold about half a liter of fluid on average. So depending on body size and things like that. The act of emptying your bladder is called urination, sometimes also called micturition. And so that's just using a combination of both voluntary and involuntary muscles to empty the contents of the bladder. And obviously, we learn control over those voluntary muscles over time. Usually, by the time you're about 2 or 3 years of age, you learn to voluntarily control your external urethral sphincter, for example. Um, when the reflex that's happening here is that as the bladder stretches, so remember that the bladder itself is made of transitional epithelium, which means it can expand, right? It can stretch out, that tissue can stretch. As it stretches, there are going to be stretch receptors embedded in the wall of the bladder that are going to trigger a spinal reflex that says that it's time to urinate, that the bladder is reaching capacity and we need to empty it. All right, so the tube that carries the urine from the bladder outside the body is the urethra. Urethra is going to be a little bit different in males and females. So in females, it tends to be very short. In males, it's much longer, and it's also a shared tube for males. So for males, it not only carries urine, but it also carries semen. All right, so let's look a little bit about how the kidney actually filters blood. Right, so the kidneys we think of as your body's filters because all of the blood in the body has to pass through these kidneys, and the kidneys are going to basically eliminate wastes, but keep the good things that we want in the bloodstream. Right, so the blood supply comes in through the renal artery. So the renal artery is bringing fresh oxygenated blood from the heart. Then that renal artery is going to split, and when it splits, it's going to split into these two segmental arteries. And then those segmental arteries are going to split again into the interlobar arteries, and they're going to split again into the arcuates, and then again into the interlobular, not to be confused with interlobar. I know those sound very similar, but these are just ever smaller vessels. We're getting into these tinier and tinier and tinier vessels until we get to the actual filtration apparatus of the kidney. Right, so those are the arteries that's bringing fresh blood in. And then the pattern goes in the opposite order to take the blood out of the kidney once it's been filtered. So we go from interlobular to arcuate to interlobar to segmental vein back to the renal vein, which is going to take us back to the inferior vena cava. All right, so a few questions here. What are the functions of your urinary system? Where do we find the kidneys? What is the outer portion and the inner portion of the kidneys? What are the subdivisions of the inner portion? Where do we collect urine? What tubes carry urine to the bladder, and what tube carries urine out of the bladder? So I'll give you a minute to think about those. All right, so there's your answers. The main functions of the urinary system are to regulate blood volume, blood pressure, and blood pH. Also going to regulate some electrolyte balance. We're going to reabsorb glucose and excrete wastes. The kidneys are located in the retroperitoneal space, so behind the peritoneum. Outer portion is the cortex, the inner portion is the medulla. The subdivisions of the inner portion are columns and pyramids. Urine is collected in the urinary bladder. The tubes that take the urine to the bladder are the ureters, and the tubes that carry urine out of the bladder is the urethra. All right, so let's now take a look at the functional unit of your kidneys. All right, so each kidney is made up of about 1 million of these tiny little functional units called nephrons. So nephron is the functional unit here. And the nephron is basically a little filter. So your kidneys themselves, you shouldn't think of it as a single filter, but as a collection of 1 million tiny little filters. And this is how your kidneys are able to filter the blood so efficiently, is you have so many of these tiny little nephrons in there that filter the blood and remove the wastes from the blood and put the good stuff back into the bloodstream and send it on its way. Right. So there's a lot of structures here. So we're going to kind of just briefly cover the anatomy of what this nephron looks like. So the first thing I want you to focus on here is the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is this round structure here, and this is where blood is going to be entering into the nephron. So blood enters the nephron through a tiny vessel called the afferent arteriole. So the afferent arteriole is going towards the glomerulus. Then we do filtration here in the glomerulus, and then the efferent arteriole is going to take blood away. So it enters in the afferent, gets filtered in the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole takes the blood away. After the glomerulus, then we go into a series of tubes. So what's in this series of tubes is basically filtrate. This was stuff that was filtered out of the blood. So the first tubes we come across are the proximal convoluted tubules. So proximal means near, convoluted means twisty, and tubules means little tubes. So the little twisty tubes that are close to the glomerulus. Then we go through what's known as the loop of Henle. Sometimes you'll just see it referred to as the nephron loop. So that's this loop that kind of dips way down all the way into the medulla. And then after the loop of Henle, we have distal convoluted tubules. So distal convoluted tubules, the twisty tubes that are further away. Distal convoluted tubule is going to take us into the collecting duct. And the collecting duct is going to join with other collecting ducts to form a papillary duct. And those papillary ducts will take us into the renal papilla, which will take us into minor calyces, major calyces, renal pelvis, and eventually out through the ureters. Okay, so let's take a close look at what that glomerulus looks like. Right, so we mentioned that we have an afferent arteriole that's carrying blood into this structure, and we've got an efferent arteriole that's carrying blood out. But what's going on inside here is we've got this ball of capillaries that's inside this round shape here. This ball of capillaries is called the glomerulus. So glomerulus itself is actually capillaries. And these capillaries is where the filtration is going to happen. So we've got this ball of capillaries that's inside a capsule, and that capsule is sometimes called Bowman's capsule, sometimes just called the glomerular capsule. All right, so those glomerular capillaries are important because this is where filtration happens, and they're actually capillaries that are between two arterioles. So rather than there being an arteriole, a capillary bed, and a venule, which is the normal pattern, here we have an arteriole, a capillary bed, and another arteriole. And then if we look at that whole structure there, so that combination of the glomerular capillaries and the cup that it sits in, Bowman's capsule, that whole structure together is called the renal corpuscle. All right, so here's our renal corpuscle, which has Bowman's capsule, and then inside Bowman's capsule, we've got the glomerulus. And then just outside of the glomerulus, but still inside the capsule, is this capsular space or Bowman's space. And that's where we're going to be pushing this filtrate. So as we filter the blood, we're drawing some stuff out of the blood. So we're drawing liquid, we're drawing some dissolved solids out of the blood and into this capsular space or Bowman's space. And this is mostly working just on the basis of pressure alone, right? So if you can kind of think back to the way that that capillary beds work in the rest of the body, how the blood hydrostatic pressure will force plasma and force small dissolved particles out of the capillary and into the tissues. A similar thing is happening here, right? So we have this glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure that's pushing fluid out through this glomerulus. But the tiny little clefts between these cells here in the glomerulus are not going to be big enough for the cells to get out. So blood cells are going to stay in the bloodstream and they will not enter the capsular space. But we'll get some plasma, we'll get a whole bunch of sugars, proteins, all this kind of waste products, all this stuff is going to enter into the capsular space. Right. So after that blood plasma gets filtered through the glomerulus, it's going to go into the capsular space, and then it's going to be drawn into the next step of the process, which is the PCT or proximal convoluted tubules. These proximal convoluted tubules, again, is this kind of twisty part of the tube that's nearest to the renal corpuscle. After the proximal convoluted tubules, we dip down into this loop of Henle. After the loop of Henle, we go to the distal convoluted tubules. Distal convoluted tubules will take us to the collecting duct. Many collecting ducts then merge together to give us this papillary duct. Right. So after all those then collecting ducts merge together into papillary ducts, then the large papillary ducts merge together to form minor calyces, and those minor calyces merge together to form 2 or 3 major calyces. The major calyces merge together to form the renal pelvis, and then the renal pelvis becomes the ureter as it exits the kidney itself. So that's the pathway that urine takes. So we're filtering it from the blood at the renal corpuscle, going to proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, papillary duct, minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, and ureter. All right. This is the same picture. So I know this one looks a little bit more complex, but basically we're looking at the same thing here. We're looking at a nephron. But in this particular nephron drawing, we're seeing not only the structures of the nephron itself, but we're seeing the structures of the blood vessels that surround the nephron. Right. So here we can see our glomerulus, so the glomerular capillaries that are going to be our main filtration point of the blood, right? So in the renal corpuscle where the blood is filtered. But then also note that we've got these vessels, all of these blood vessels that are surrounding these structures of the nephron. So we've got all of these what are known as peritubular capillaries, right? So these are capillaries that are surrounding the nephron. Because we're not, that first time that we filter the blood out of the glomerulus, we're not done yet. So the complete kind of sorting out of what's good and what's bad and what's going to go out in the urine and what's going to go back in the bloodstream hasn't all happened at the glomerulus. We need to associate the rest of these tubes with capillaries as well so that we can kind of fine tune the contents of the urine and the contents of the blood. All right, so last few questions here. What's the functional unit of the kidney? What happens in the renal corpuscle? What structure carries blood in? What carries blood out? What are the capillaries called that are inside that structure? What's the cup called? And what is the order of the tubes after the cup? All right, so there's your answers. The functional unit of the kidney is the nephron, so each kidney has about 1 million nephrons in it. The renal corpuscle, his job is to filter blood, right? So that's where blood filtration happens. The afferent arteriole carries blood in, the efferent arteriole carries blood out, and in between the afferent and efferent arteriole is a ball of capillaries known as the glomerulus. The cup that glomerulus sits in is Bowman's capsule. And then after Bowman's capsule, the order of the tubes that we pass through is going to be proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, papillary duct, and then into the calyces. All right, so I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.